You're listening to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, everybody, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're back on a Monday night. That's right, you're watching Head, a Star Wars show, which we actually very rarely mention the name of the show, but whatever. That's how it goes. But yeah, this is another episode of our show, and of course, because we thought that Tales of the Jedi was being released a little bit before it actually is, kind of leaves our Mondays open to talk about whatever, like we used to do. But yeah, today's actually pretty interesting because you ran across this. You sent it earlier because today was another one of those famous days where it's a day of the show and we're like, yeah, what are we going to talk about today? And I mean, look, I know that that's bad practice for YouTube because, you know, you're supposed to create these things a little bit in advance, you know, so everybody that's subscribed or whatever can you know, access it or whatever and check it out and see what you're going to talk about and then plan accordingly. But, you know, every once in a while, and this is what's funny because you and I were talking about this, you either get like all these stories just hitting at once to the point where we're sitting there going, man, you know, which it's almost like you got to prioritize. It's like, well, which one of these do we really want to make the focus of the show? I mean, even though being that it's a discussion-based show, we can talk about anything we want, really. I was even going to suggest we do, some YouTubers are doing this, and it's kind of a cool thing where they almost do like an open mic thing. Now on those, it's almost like, you know, you can ask almost anything, but I mean, we could do that anyway, but I was going to say open mic as it relates to Star Wars, because a lot of times we do have a topic that we're talking about, and people want to tend to, pardon the Star Wars pun, stay on topic. And, you know, I thought it might be fun maybe every once in a while to just do kind of a free-form Star Wars discussion to where people can bring up anything that, you know, whatever. But
yeah.
But, and again, you know, you guys could do that anyway. I mean, just because we're talking about a topic doesn't mean we're automatically going to shut out. It's like, no, that's not about today's topic. But no, it's, you know, we're just all hanging out talking about Star Wars. But yeah, so you'll either get all these things that are happening at once and you're sitting there trying to prioritize in your head, like, well, what should we talk about? What should we do? Or it's the opposite. It's like this week, for instance, where it's pretty much a ghost town of stories. And now you're sitting there just going, man, you know, what are we gonna do? Because we're so used to, unfortunately, just so much happening that, you know, it just becomes one of those things. So you actually brought this one up today where Katie Sackhoff was actually being interviewed, and she alluded to the fact that the Mandalorian creators actually have an end game in mind. Like they've basically started creating the whole ending of this series. And, you know, of course, the interviewer was trying to get out of her, well, so how many seasons is it going to go? And, you know, naturally she's being coy as usual, as you have to be when you're a Star Wars actor, where it's like, well,
right.
You know, I know, but I'm basically not going to tell you guys. So that begs the question that you were talking about, which you thought would be an interesting thing. And I'll turn it over to you here in a second. But I thought it was fascinating, too, because first, I was thinking of it in terms of, well, how many seasons do we think it's going to go? How do we think it's going to end and all that stuff? And certainly, obviously, that's part of this discussion, too. But I thought that your point was interesting when we were talking about this, where you were actually bringing it out as more of a series-based thing, right? Like, how do you know when a series should end? What are the signs, you know, that a series should actually end? You want to go out on top, but at the same time, you also want to be able to tell multiple stories, and you don't want to end prematurely, in other words.
Right.
So
yeah, Yeah, the big thing is, and this is kind of the basis of the discussion tonight. I'm sure it will also detour into other areas as well, but that's what we do here. um, no, but the thing is, um, how much is too much of a show, right?
Right.
So, how much is too much of the Mandalorian in this particular instance? So, Mandalorian so far we're getting ready to head into the third season of this great show. It's done well thus far, and out of this particular show, we've gotten some spinoffs already. We've already got the Book of Boba Fett. Ahsoka is coming soon off of this. So these are all characters that have been in live action, kind of introduced in this show, The Mandalorian.
Hmm.
So now like I said, we're reaching our third season, coming up at probably like the beginning of 2023. And so, much like other series that you and I have talked about, namely Cobra Kai, that's something you hear often on this show now, along with a
Well,
few
and
Star Trek
actually,
references.
yeah, and especially for tonight's discussion, because that's honestly a prime example, right? That's a show that
Hmm.
if you could make the argument that it actually gets better with each season, although
Hmm.
there are some people that might like, say season 1 better than all the other ones, but the point is they've maintained a high quality and fans love it and want more, but at the same time, it's you don't want to stay too long at the party. You don't want to get to the point to where you release that
Hmm.
season and everybody's sort of lukewarm to it, and then you make the decision to stop based on the fact that nobody wants
Yeah.
it anymore. So,
Yeah.
there's that.
Yeah, you want to come out, you want to end shows like Michael Jordan did when he, retired the last time, game winning shot, well, I won't say the last time, but one of the, the last championship he won, that should have been it for him. But then he decided to still try to come back and, he played with the Wizards and it wasn't, he wasn't the same old Michael. And, eventually he just kind of withered away and that was it. But you kind of want to go out on top. And that's basically what we're saying. So
Yeah,
for a
but
show like The Mandalorian, for the show like Mandalorian, and like I said, we just made reference to Cobra Kai. Those are two very popular shows, right? And have a lot of traction, have a lot of fan base, and great stories, right? So, at what point do we say, as Star Wars fans, okay, we've had enough of the Mandalorian, we need to go explore something else? So that's kind of the premise of this discussion.
yeah, and I mean, and I thought that was really good too, because it obviously the cliche thing for us to talk about is, well, how long do we think it's going to go, and how do we think it's going to end? And certainly that, like I said before, that is part of this discussion. However,
Hmm.
the other thing too is that, and you brought this up, because even with Michael Jordan saying anything else, if he hadn't come back to sports, right,
Hmm.
and he just sort of went out on top, and that was it, people would forever be saying, "Oh man, he went out and
Too
he
early.
yeah, it was like right, I mean it's too bad
He
he
had
didn't
another
go
one
for
left.
yeah, like maybe he went 2 more seasons or something. I mean it's kind of like if you do make the decision to go out on top or to go out when it just kind of feels right or whatever, you run the risk of people forever speculating, oh, what would have happened if they had gone a couple extra ones? What great stories could we have had or whatever?
Hmm.
Problem
Yeah.
is, the flip side of that is that you do keep going because that's what fans want, but then you hit that first bumpy season. Now, it should be
Hmm.
noted, and this definitely happened with Married with Children. Um, it's happened with some other shows too, where what happens is any long running show, say you run over 10 seasons,
Hmm.
actually, even if you can even say 8 seasons, but what'll happen is your first 4 or 5 seasons, 6 seasons maybe, are just incredible, right? They're amazing right out the gate. They're just
Knocking it out the park.
knocking it out of the park. They're on top of the world. Then it starts to decline in quality a little bit because you start running out of ideas. And you run out of places, quite frankly, for the characters to go. And the once winning formula becomes cliched now. And so then what happens is you have to endure like 2 or 3 seasons sometimes of that slump. And then a lot of times what'll happen with these long running shows is that all of a sudden, I don't know, they get a spark of creativity, or maybe the characters incrementally move into a certain direction where you can light that fire again, and all of a sudden the quality shoots up. And that's basically what happened. I gave Married with Children as an example. First 5, 6 seasons maybe, they were really, really good, really funny, really original. But like seasons, I don't know, 8, 9, and 10, especially when they started bringing 7 into it and all that stuff, it was like they're just kind of dropping the ball, And then it was the last 2 seasons, 10 and 11, where they really started to find their stride. Kelly and Bud were older; they were able to get some new creative stories out of that, and I really felt like the show was picking back up again and hitting its stride. And then, of course, they were canceled. But that happens with a lot of shows where the show will lose its way for a couple of seasons, and then all of a sudden it comes up. So the problem is, you get a show like, say, The Mandalorian, right? And especially with all the scrutiny that Star Wars is under. What ends up happening is the first season that would be considered maybe somewhat of a slump, or at least not as great as the other ones, everybody's going to be like, oh, yeah, man, they should end this thing. It's it's growing tired or whatever. You get all the critics saying, oh, there's too much Star Wars now. People are, have Star Wars fatigue or whatever. That's probably something that they'll say. And then, well, for all we know, they might have a season or 2 like that, and then it might get good again, or to stay too long at the party.
Yeah, I mean, no, you bring up very, very valid points, and even to your the Married with Children, that's a great comparison. There's several TV shows that are kind of like you said, that have that moment where it was like, okay, it was good, it was good, it was good, and then it hits slump for maybe a couple of seasons, but then it pops back in. But I think right now in this day and age, right, you don't have the patience of society like we once did. You got to think about it. Back when Married with Children was on the air, in the 90s, the internet wasn't really a thing, and it wasn't, you didn't have all this uh extra chatter that you could read about and make videos and vlog, what I'm saying, all these different things about. So society itself is differently, and it has, quite frankly, it has a shorter attention excuse me, a shorter attention span. So you have to understand that about that demographic of your audience now, that 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 changed. And so now you can't, and even when you think about it, like a lot of shows don't go, now we're dealing with like series that only are what, 10 episodes, sometimes 12.
Yeah, that's
We don't
a
have the
big
24
change.
we
Yeah.
don't have the 24 episodes like we used to for that makes a season anymore either. So now, there's a lot of different things that have changed society wise as far as how we view content. And so, we even talked about they even talked about Marvel fatigue, right? The whole superhero stuff is like, okay, every year there's another superhero movie we're getting, whether it's from Marvel, whether it's from DC, whether it's from some other thing, it's so I think a lot of people are kind of like, all right, all these superhero movies are coming out. I'm kind of getting tired of it. Like, can we get a break from that and go to something else? And I understand why people will say that. But on the flip side, too, it's kind of like I understand why a lot of people are trying to make these movies, because the technology is here and strike while the iron is hot. And you can finally tell these stories, or you can finally show these characters in a manner in which they were I'm kind of created to do. You know what I mean? Like now you can show Spider-Man doing the things that, you read in the comic books as a kid, versus, the 1970s when he's like in some pajamas running around the city of New York, whatever,
I still love that show though. That was
you
that was
know.
really good. Conversation for another
So
time, perhaps, but
yeah, definitely. But me, I love my 60s Batman. So
sure.
But it's still, but once again, it doesn't compare to anything that's been even from '89. It doesn't compare to any of that stuff. So that's what I mean. Like, when we're looking at a show like The Mandalorian, how do we know when we've had enough? And I think once you kind of get to the point where you're struggling to write for the
Mm-hmm.
character, stop.
Yeah.
That's the system. That's your system. That's your body telling you, okay, I can't lift anymore. Right? I maxed out. Put the weight up. Maybe go do another exercise. Maybe go do something, and you may be able to come back to it. Because that's the thing. The cool thing about the Mandalorian is because, especially the time frame in which it sits in, it's post Return of the Jedi, and we have all this space in time. We got like 30 years between that and The Force Awakens. So even if you wanted to bring back the Mandalorian, let's just say 5 more years, let's say you got an idea like, okay, you know what? It's been 5 years since we've done the Mandalorian, but we've got some really good stories now because we've gotten a spark. Okay, well, you can kind of bring it back and do whatever if you feel so inclined to. But as we often say on the show, and we will continue to say, it's all about the story. As long as you have a good story to tell it. But once you get to the point where you're struggling and you're forcing the story, no pun intended, it's time to put the weights up and move on to cardio or something like that. But don't keep trying to, because then you're going to end up hurting yourself or hurting the franchise even more by trying to go beyond what you can do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I think both of us have always said is that if you have to force it, don't do it. If you run out of story to
Hmm.
tell, don't do it. That's one of the things that I think Cobra Kai is facing right now, actually. Now, the creators have said, hey, we've got a lot more stories. There's definitely a season 6 coming, and,
Hmm.
you know, just wait. However, as a viewer, you're looking at the way season 5 ended and everything else. It's kind of like, wow, this is a really good place to stop. You know, they kind of wrapped up all the storylines. It's in a good spot. This might be, if you were talking about launching some spin-offs or something, this may be the good time to, instead of doing a season 6, go ahead and spin off with different characters or whatever. On the other hand, if you have motivated writers and they say, look,
Hmm.
we got some really, really cool stories to tell, and they've already done 5 seasons of amazing stories, you got to believe them. And The Mandalorian, one of the things that I like, and this is where it does come into a, somewhat of a comparison with Cobra Kai, is the thing that you actually have in common with Favreau and Filoni and then the creators of Cobra Kai is that they both have an end game. Now, the Cobra Kai writers basically had an end game from the very beginning. Like, they knew the whole
Hmm.
story, right? They knew the story from beginning to end. They said so. They basically had the whole story. Now, what they did say was it's somewhat modular. If they were told, "Hey, next season's going to be your last season," or whatever, within each of the seasons, starting right from season 1, they're like, "Okay, we could adjust it so we can complete the story in 3 seasons, 4 seasons." But they also said if they let us go like 7 or 8 seasons, we can do that too. And there won't be like a lot of filler or anything. And so the difference is the Cobra Kai creators basically had the end game, the whole story written from the very beginning, which is, I think, a
Hmm.
great idea. And I wish more people would do that. Favreau and
Sure.
Filoni, on the other hand, they're starting to figure that out now. But the point is, they're figuring it out. They're not just mindlessly going, multiple seasons or whatever and just meandering. Now, of course, you could make the argument that with The Mandalorian, that's the one show you could do almost open ended because it can
Hmm.
almost be, all right, he's just kind of going on his thing. It's the adventure of the week kind of thing. It's not necessarily as tied down to a particular place or a particular story or anything like that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
still, it's comforting to know that they have some stories in mind. Now, before we go on, we got a couple of chats here that, and that this is a discussion show, and we keep yammering about how much we want discussion from our friends online. We got to get to them. All right, so first, David Sumler Jr. says, "Hello, gentlemen. What are your thoughts on the more grounded tone, costume design, and visual elements in comparison to a massive CGI battle? Side note, I'm sorry about last week's joke, poor taste." I don't even remember. And it really was like 3 days ago. But I'm sure it was fine, whatever it was. We're the kings of tasteless jokes, actually.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the things that really attracted us and a lot of other Star Wars fans to the show. Because The Mandalorian, I don't know, I think The Mandalorian kind of strikes that balance, though, So you basically have, and you could even say all this stuff within the Marvel universe, too, right? Because obviously, you look at the Avengers films, and that's just like the epitome of the massive CGI battles and stuff like that. But then you have more grounded stuff like the Hawkeye series or something like that, and they work equally well. I mean, I just think that, and again, and you're probably going to agree with me on this. It's not that the whole big CGI battle and all that stuff is necessarily bad. It's just if it's just not contained within a good story, that's when it becomes horrible and mindless. It's like if you're using that as a crutch, like, oh, look, effects and pretty stuff, it's like then yes, you're gonna have a problem. But if it's framed within a good story, and of course that's dealing with the story, well then, I mean, I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely echo what you're saying. I mean, you can have all the effects you want, and that's really the cake, really. But the flavor of the show is really in the ingredients of the story.
Yes.
And full of analogies today, I guess.
Well,
but but yeah, that's the thing. I like the fact that it's more of a realistic, even, and when I don't mean just okay, it's shot in practical places and things like that. Although that's part of it, but even you can even say
well, The
maybe some parts of
Mandalorian kind of
Mandalorian.
isn't, though.
What?
Well, I mean, it's
Shot in real
shot on the
places?
volume.
Well, yeah, shot on the volume. Yeah, but I'm saying
Andor
it
is
gives
more
it
the
that.
practical, but I mean, I know what you mean,
But
though.
that's what I was. Yeah, that's what I was referring to. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. But yeah, Andor being the show that's kind of shot on practical locations, and that's what gives a lot of its grounding in realism. But it's more so of conversation, the type of things that are happening, so that makes it more real grounded. Whereas Mandalorian kind of it's more Star Wars, if I can use that terminology.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
so
it's grounded, though, for a Star Wars. Like see,
it
that's the
is very
difference.
grounded for a Star Wars show. Yes.
Yeah, the Mandalorian actually feels like Star Wars. It maintains a certain grounded element to it, but yet it feels like Star Wars. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
Andor kind of feels like its
Andor.
own thing taking place in the Star Wars universe. Definitely with episode 4. And again, if you guys haven't seen, we did start to review those shows. So if you check out our Andor reviews, you'll know more about what we're talking about. But yeah, that more or less feels less like Star Wars and more like just a general spy thriller that takes place in the Star Wars universe, which is certainly fine. But, within the context of this conversation, though, you have, and of course, the Andor thing is, I just thought about this, but that's a perfect example, too, because remember, that was supposed to be a 5-season show. And Tony Gilroy, who was the director and one of the writers of the thing, or I think he might be the writer of the thing, he basically said, nope, it's going down to 2 seasons. And what they're going to do is they're going to do like these 3-episode story arcs. And so again, it's kind of like you have to know when to quit, when not to stay at the party too long.
Yeah. Um, the thing is, and this is, going to the Mandalorian. So they've already been approved. That like I said, we're coming up on season 3. There's
Yeah.
a season 4 that's already been greenlit already. That's already ready to go as well. You're probably it's probably starting on it already in some way, shape, or form. So we know those two are good. Now, will we get anything more after that? Don't know. Um, I think that the Mandalorian has this. You kind of alluded to it earlier, Eric, where it's very open ended. Like there's no linear story that it has to follow. It's not like, okay, well, I could see if season 1 we found Grogu and Grogu has to eventually become a Jedi or something like that. Okay, well
Mm-hmm.
then we kind of have to follow that. We have to see him eventually get to that point. It's no different than Smallville, right? Smallville, okay, we see Clark in high school. He eventually has to get to Superman, or at least right before he becomes, and that's exactly what happened. He basically becomes Superman at the very end of it all, and that's it. So there's not a linear path for this particular show, because it's like you said, it's like more of the adventure of the week type thing, which has made it very fluid for different characters to come in and come out of this show, like we have seen with Boba Fett, with Ahsoka, and then now they're able to spin off and kind of do their own thing. And in the very very beginning, we said it that Mandalorian was kind of the hub. And like, all right, this is the main system for like live action television for the most part out of the Star Wars franchise, and then things are just going to kind of pop out of this, and
Mm-hmm.
then maybe things to spin off of those shows, and on it goes, right? So, and that's why Mandalorian was able to pop into Boba Fett series. I'm sure he might even pop up in the Ahsoka series. We don't know, just depending on how they
Oh, I
decide to do
think so.
things.
I mean,
So,
maybe not season 1, but
right, but at
then
some
again, I
point,
don't know. Yeah, at some point.
yeah.
Let me get to some of these, because Kriston Moore basically has like a bunch of stuff here.
Oh,
Um,
Chris.
says, unfortunately, if Mando series ends, the character should become one with the Force. Um, goes on to say, unpopular opinion, but it would be the most honorable. And of course, for Mandalore. Yes, right?
For Mandalore.
Well, I guess that depends on how you look at things, because, and this kind of segues into something that I was going to bring up anyway, and that is one of the smart things I think to do, because like you said, a lot of these series now are, like 10 episodes or something. And what I think in Star Wars, what they should do is they could set up movies this way, right? So you have like the
Hmm.
Mandalorian series when it comes time to actually end the series. So when you don't want to keep coming up with the adventure of the week or some story arc or something like that, because the Mandalorian actually does both of those, I think, quite well. You get that very much adventure of the week feel, yet it does have a story arc that goes through the entire season. The first
Hmm.
season, of course, was he discovers Grogu and he has to try to get Grogu back to the Jedi, which, of course, actually, that's kind of the storyline for seasons 1 and 2. Now, for season 3, we're going to have something a little bit different. It's going to be the whole Mandalorian thing and him trying to get his status back and figuring out where he fits in within that culture. But what they could do, once they decide, look, we're going to end this, it's going to be done, whatever, they could then just make Mandalorian films. And when I say that, I don't necessarily always mean theatrically. Disney Plus has a lot of feature-length movies that were created just for Disney Plus. So you could easily do that, right? You could just make a feature film once every couple of years or whatever.
Yeah, you could, but I think with the gross success of the show, though, I think this one would have to go into the theaters because it's such,
Oh, well, yeah. I
you
mean, I'm
know.
not saying that.
So
I mean,
yeah, but I
any
think for
Star Wars that's a
this,
movie should. Well, I won't say that. That kind of negates it, because we did talk about the whole Heir to the Empire thing, and And there were certain things that we thought could work as theatrical, well, not theatrical releases, but feature film releases on Disney Plus. But yeah, I think both of us have always said Star Wars is a theatrical experience, first and foremost. And yeah, I mean, these shows are great. And in some ways, they actually exceed my expectations because I remember you and I were talking about it before The Mandalorian came out. It's like, I don't know how Star Wars is going to fit on the small screen. I mean, the animated shows, yeah. But a live action show, it's one of those things. Do you actually think that while you're watching this, man, I wish this were in the theaters. Man, I wish this were, a film instead of I mean, those were the things that I think people were sort of struggling with. And to our pleasant surprise, Star Wars actually works very well on the small screen. Let me sneak this other chat before we get going, as I'm sure we will, because I know we could talk about this topic forever. But Chris basically has this other thing that he wants to point out, too. It's going back to Andor. He's talking about the Andor series when we made comments about that. It says, feels like Rogue One, a good standalone by itself that exists in the Star Wars universe. And yeah, that was something, and again, I encourage anybody that hasn't seen our Andor reviews to go back and check those out. Not now, of course, because you're watching this. Finish watching this and finish hitting that like button and that subscribe button if you haven't done so. But then go back and check out the Andor reviews because we go into that a little bit. We talk about how it actually has sort of a Rogue One vibe to it, which of course makes sense. Cassian Andor was a Rogue One character. And Tony Gilroy, the guy that's the showrunner basically, was the guy that they brought in to punch up and rewrite and reshoot some of Rogue One's scenes. So that makes sense. The Mandalorian, on the other hand, that's kind of a Favreau Filoni thing, and it definitely has their stamp all over it. So,
Sure.
I think that once they do end it, they could do theatrical releases every once in a while with this character.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good way to end it, honestly. Like if you were going to end the series,
End it with a film.
end it with a film.
That's not a bad
just
idea.
That way it's like, okay, you finally get that theatrical experience. It's like, all right, cool. You finally see everything resolved, and then, it goes away. And, that, but then that depending on how they do with the only thing they have to be careful of is if this character is popping up in other series. Because if you kill him off,
Well, yeah, and I don't.
then you have to just make sure that when you kill him off, when he appears in other episodes of other shows, it's prior to this. You see what I'm saying?
Not necessarily.
They're just gonna just have to.
I got two words:
Well,
Darth Maul. Look, the man was cut in half.
I got one word for you. Well, I actually got two words for you. Force user.
Oh, I thought it was going to be another F word that you were going to try to use.
No.
That would have been two words too.
Yeah, that's true.
Force user. Well, yeah. All right, that's true. Yeah. The whole kept himself alive through the dark side thing. But still, I mean, look, General Grievous wasn't a Force user, and they took out like his brain and his heart or something and shoved it into a droid. Just saying, there's a way you could work around. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that. Oh wait,
I'm not gonna get into this with you today, Eric.
Yeah, I know.
Oh,
I know. Hold on, we got another. So he says, "Notice I said become one with the Force, not killed off." Okay.
Yeah.
We might have to re-explain Star. Yeah, otherwise we might have to re-explain how Star Wars works.
Chris, I know you're a huge fan because we've talked about this all throughout like high school, but I have to. Yeah, you got to explain this one to me. Unless he's doing some like Chiro Imwe type thing, one with the Force is with me thing. But
well, and I mean, but the thing is, and this is what's interesting too, because he says, well, I'm gonna actually put this up here. I could just read it, but you know, I mean, I have the capability. Why not? He says Han came back.
Right.
Just saying. No, he didn't. See, that's the
No.
thing. He did not come back. He was basically a figment of Kylo's imagination. That wasn't actually Han Solo. Now, there's some theories behind that too, because the one that we put out there was that Leia was the one that was kind of projecting that whole thing while she was,
Mm-hmm.
you know, trying to do this whole like force energy thing to him or whatever. They could have explained that a lot better, I thought, but is what it is. But the thing is,
Maz kind of hinted around that.
Yeah, she did, and I mean that's what I mean. It's kind of like it was a little bit ambiguous. While the explanation was generally there, and I think what JJ was trying to do was maybe not make it too definite and leave a little bit up to the imagination. I think the other problem, though, is when you start doing that, there's some things I think you really should explain in these things. And that's what I liked about Lucas's approach, is that he explained and pretty much put literally what was out there when it was necessary, and then he kind of pulled back. David's got another thing here. He says, do you think the Hollywood industry is ripe for movie magic and creativity given our political cultural landscape? It seems the prime of movie making gas past, and masterpieces are an anomaly. Well, I see what you're saying because it's true, right? Like the whole Hollywood woke agenda thing is definitely strong, although I think there's just a lot of people that are bucking that trend. Man, there was a movie made recently where I was like, wow, I'm surprised that was made this, you know. And this is something you would think in the 90s, right? But, you know, you have had these great things that were made in the past. Now, even in the not too distant past, again, it was a Netflix film, but like The Irishman, which is a Scorsese film. I mean, it was phenomenal. And a lot of what Martin Scorsese still does is pretty much ignoring a lot of that stuff, and certainly would fall into the masterpiece realm. You know, Quentin Tarantino, another one. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You know, great film. So, I mean, they're out there. And I think a lot of the future of this stuff, and honestly, I think even beyond the cultural and social agendas that are being pushed somewhat, I think just the future of a lot of films is streaming. You know, people still love the theatrical experience, and nothing can replace that. But I think that the whole streaming thing has reshaped, in a way, the movie industry.
Yeah. Even in Star Wars, right? And we've covered this before. For example, John Boyega, uh, Moses Ingram, you know, they've had their bouts with racial issues from Disney, and you know the characters that they've played, right? And so, although you know we've seen a lot of progression and a lot of things, and some people feel like, okay, you know, they're shoehorning in African Americans into Star Wars into certain roles and positions because trying to be in this whole woke thing. But like, need I remind you, like, you know, I always try to tell people when they bring this up, is like, okay, did you forget about Billy D. Williams back in the 80s? Did you forget
Right.
about Samuel L. Jackson in
Right.
99 when he popped up as Mace Windu? I mean,
Prominent
like,
characters too.
these are prominent actors at that.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not
I
like
never understood that whole thing. And what was funny was, and this is really interesting because obviously, you know, the whole race relation thing back in the 80s wasn't quite as advanced as it became later on. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still issues, but we have come a little further.
Yeah.
You didn't actually, you would think that given the time period that the whole introduction of Lando Calrissian, it would
Mhm.
have caused, and certainly in some of the more racial, um, like racist groups or something, neo-Nazis and the like, I'm sure they probably had a lot to say. And you could also make the argument that had the internet been around back then, maybe you would have seen a little bit more, but it
Yeah.
really wasn't as big of a deal as, like the concept of a black stormtrooper. And I'm like, but
Yeah.
you had a black Jedi, who, by the way, was second only to Yoda in the entire thing. And that didn't seem to bother
Yeah.
anybody. I
Yeah, it's actually people thought it was cool. But I mean there's a lot of different, it's not just the racial thing, but I mean I get like, okay, making Ray, the lead character, is pushing the whole feminist agenda.
Sure.
People putting the LGBTQ stamp into every single thing that we watch and digest now. It's everything, and I think that's what he's referring to is this everything that's being like shoved into
Sure.
movies where it's like like it's blatantly uh put there, where it's like it would be different if the story actually if it
Yeah.
actually went with the story.
Yeah.
But to just shoehorn something in there just
Right.
because you're trying to make a certain group or particular groups feel comfortable for
Mm-hmm.
some things, it's kind of like, and that's a problem that you have, unfortunately, in Hollywood right now, is that everybody's trying to appease, all these different types of groups and things like that. And my thing is just worry about making movies. Just make good movies.
Exactly. Just make
It
good movies.
leave the politics to the politicians, in my opinion.
Well, and to go a step further, right? I mean, one of the things about Star Wars is that it's it's sci-fi fantasy. It's supposed to
Hmm.
be timeless. It's basically as timeless as, Once Upon a Time, whatever, right? I mean, and
Right.
Lucas designed it that way.
Hmm.
And one of the problems that he said, although, there were certain little allegories that he would make here and there, but even those were really more or less timeless.
Hmm.
It's the danger is if you put a lot of these like agendas and stuff into Star Wars, it damages it because now it stamps it to a particular time period. Now
Right.
it marries it to that time period. It loses that timelessness.
Hmm.
And it's not an expose, it's not a documentary, it's a sci-fi fantasy film. Let's just let that, Um so Chris says, all I'm saying is that Tar Vizsla was a force sensitive Mandalorian. Okay, we're back on the back on this. There could be a good explanation of why Mando and Grogu found each other. Well, yes, except, well, I guess if you want to pull the whole will of the force thing, which has been used a time or two in Star Wars
Hmm.
when it's convenient. So
Hmm.
yes, you could say that, the Force kind of moved Din to be the one to take that job because the Force knew what Din was going to do, and I mean, I could hang with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I
But
I think Star Wars
the
works
key
best when
part
it's ambiguous, though, like when it's
But the big part is that Tar Vizsla was actually a Jedi, though. Like he was a
right.
Mandalorian, but he's actually a Jedi. So it made sense for him to do the things that he was doing. Mando doesn't show any of that ability. I mean, that doesn't mean that the Force. I mean, let the Force probably willed Han Solo and all them to kind of run into each other because they knew that band of people would actually get the job done between Han, Luke, and Leia and Obi-Wan. But really, you know, it's just kind of like I don't think that makes Mando
No, the problem
to
is
come back
that
into the Force. If I think that's what he's still referring to.
yeah, I know. And I
Um,
mean, the problem is that when you define too many things, especially with the Force, I think it becomes a little bit dangerous and takes away from Star Wars a little. It's purposely vague.
mhm.
I mean, even the midi-chlorian thing, right? I mean, it was so much more elegant and nicer with Obi-Wan's whole explanation in episode 4 of, it surrounds us, it binds us, it,
The energy field.
yeah, it's
All right.
basically like it just, you know, it it was just so much better when you try to make it more sci-fi than fantasy, where it's okay, it's these midi-chlorians, and how many midi-chlorians is. I mean, I get what he was trying to do, but it took away from it a little. David said, unless you and Daryl have secret contact with Disney to make TV series, be easily in the top 3 in Star Wars history. Thank you very much. I think Eric is being very optimistic. What was I being optimistic about? I kind of forgot.
But
let's see.
No, we don't have a contract with Disney, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately. If we did, well, we'd still
some
do the
things
show.
I can't give help on. I hear you, Chris.
Well, and again, look, like I said, I mean, when it comes to some of the things that have been put out there, I mean, it makes about as much sense as things that have actually appeared on film. I mean,
yeah.
You know, where there's a will, there's a way, so to speak. You know, there's a lot of times where I think that, and this is where I think there's a danger in explaining too much. And I think that that's what people try to do. And there's a lot of dangers. In fact, one of the things that I've kind of wanted to do, and maybe we could do this for one of the Monday shows or pre-records that we end up having to do, because we could literally do a whole show on just the dangers of trying to define too much in Star Wars and the negative effects that it has had when they do it, you know, because when a franchise is as old as this is now, that's when a lot of these dangers start to become a thing. Because if you think about it, the first time that it happened was when Lucasfilm basically sold the rights and licenses or whatever to actually make Star Wars novels. Because during the time of the original trilogy, and when Lucas was thinking of his prequels, everything was coming from him. I mean, sure, he had a team that, you know, there were people that contributed, certainly. I mean, I'm not saying that everything in the world, but it began and ended with him, though. And he came up with the stories. So when you have something that is that controlled and that is pretty much coming from a single source like that, which can be good and bad, by the way, it's a little bit better. But now when you start to open it up, yeah, you're going to get a lot of cool stories, and you're going to get more because you just got more people working on them. What started to happen with the expanded universe is they started painting themselves into corners that they couldn't really get out of. And that's the same thing that happens as a franchise ages. You know, now you start to be concerned about things. One of the reasons why Star Wars became the pop cultural icon that it became is because, and I don't think people have thought about this, it's because Lucas didn't care about what people thought. You know, he was like, look, I'm making these things for me, and, you know, this is kind of the message that I want to get out or whatever. And he wasn't worried about how much money something was going to make or expanding the audience or any of that stuff. He's in essence, he's still an independent filmmaker at heart. And that's the way he treated Star Wars, as an independent film that was distributed by a studio and make gazillions of dollars. The problem is that Disney cares very much about profitability. And that is what is destroying Star Wars. And that is the primary difference between what drives Disney Star Wars versus Lucas Star Wars. And I think that if Disney started to adopt the more Lucas approach, because a lot of times people are blaming the directors or writers or whatever. It's not them. You know, if you just let these guys tell creative stories and you weren't worried about it. And what's funny is the movies would probably make more money because people wouldn't have as much of a negative reaction to them.
No, here, man. I mean, that's I couldn't have said it better. I mean, you hit it right on the head. Disney, I mean, when you start having, because you have to think about it, you know, you're dealing with a major corporation. So that alone just shows you, like, okay, they're all in the interest of making money. Whatever's going to make the money, they're on board for. The problem is that what do you sacrifice in the pursuit of that?
Right.
And Lucas, on the flip side, he's like you said, he's a storyteller by nature. That's what he does. That's what he excels at. Even he's better at telling stories than he is as a director.
Mm-hmm.
As we've seen, like because if you look at the direction from A New Hope versus Empire Strikes Back, it's two completely, with Irvin Kershner at the helm versus Lucas, completely different. You know, and that's why Empire is probably like everyone's favorite film was because, but Lucas wrote the story though. And of course, he had help. Of course, Irvin Kershner, help punched it up and
Well, and
things like
Lawrence
that. But
Kasdan. Lawrence Kasdan was
and
the one
Lawrence
that actually
Kasdan was the
pretty
other
much
part.
wrote the
Yeah,
script, and he's the one that. And that's the thing. It's that everybody contributed, but the point is, even though multiple
it's
people
coming from
contributed,
him.
not only is it coming from him, but even with the contributions, nobody was sitting there thinking like, oh, this thing's got to be. And what's funny is if you go back and look at the making of the original Star Wars, The New Hope,
Hmm.
he had everything on the line. I mean,
Hmm.
if that movie had failed, he probably still would be paying off debts. So
Hmm.
he really, if you really stop and think about it, he had more to lose than Disney ever could
Hmm.
because Lucas's life would have been over. He was just pretty much fresh out of school. He had a couple of films under his belt. He did American Graffiti, which was a success, but Star Wars bankrupted him basically, and if it had failed, he would have been ruined financially.
Hmm.
And when you really go back, especially if you watch that Empire of Dreams documentary, I mean, he was in just dire straits. I mean, that movie almost had to do what it did in order to just get him out of there. And so much so, and people forget about this too, that Empire Strikes Back wasn't actually the original. That's the movie that Lucas wanted to make, but he actually had that Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which ended up being turned into a
Yep.
novel. But that was actually, in case,
The sequel.
yeah, that was going to be the sequel in case A New Hope didn't do so well at the box office because it could be made cheaply. So
Hmm.
there's like all kinds of stuff that motivated him. But even through it all, it was always about the story, it was always about the art. And if you put the art
Hmm.
first, the dollars will follow. And, Chris basically says, yeah, it's true. That's why the fan base is so split nowadays. And
Absolutely.
that's it. I mean, they are responsible for this whole toxic fan base thing because they're handling it all wrong. And it's almost like they're getting a little bit less blind to it. But unfortunately, it's too bad they couldn't have been less blind to it like 4 or 5 years ago. David says, Disney gave you all a movie contract. Daryl would make another Stomp the Yard movie featuring the Sigmas. He's just going to let that one go.
Nope, I'm not.
Uh-oh.
David?
He's being put on
You've
notice.
crossed the line.
That's right.
You've crossed the line. At this point, I would rather see you sit on the head of a unicorn. Thank you very much. Now,
Ouch.
moving forward.
It's not the yard we're going to stomp.
Exactly. It's going to stomp the David.
Ooh, anyway. Yeah.
Brotherly quarrel. No, never mind. But yeah, no, I think, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, that's one of the things that I hope. And that's something, by the way, that I think Favreau and Filoni understand. See, they're not driven by the profit margin so much. They're totally into the story. And I don't think it's any accident that their shows are better.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing about being, that's the thing about being a fan of the actual franchise. These guys are actually super fans of Star Wars itself, including J.J. Abrams, which is why even The Force Awakens did as well as it did. And it brought people back because he understood. And a lot of people say, yeah, it was very derivative. But even in that, though, you can see though, like, okay, he gets Star Wars though. He
Well, yeah, that
gets
was
the
purposely done.
concepts. Yeah, I know. It was because to bring everybody in and bring up people who've never seen Star Wars before, like this new generation.
Mm-hmm.
It gives them the same feeling that we had when we saw it, and that
Right.
was the objective. But that's what I'm saying. Like he gets it because he's a fan of the franchise. He's truly understands that more than anything. And that's what you need in Star Wars, but also you need to like get out of the way of these creators and stop trying to, chase the dollar and chase the art and really understand. And that's what's crazy because it's like, every other, show or movie, oh, George Lucas visited the set today. It's like, well, like, how do you have the man who created this sitting here and you don't, what I mean?
Well,
it's
he
it's
has.
mind-boggling to
There have
me
been rumors that he's actually, there was even like some scene or something in The Mandalorian season 2 that they said he actually
that he
directed.
actually directed.
Yeah, that he
Yeah.
just, it's like, look, man, you're here. Why don't you just, come over here and,
Yeah.
hit that mark there and, just for old time's sake, right? I mean, and that's what you
Right.
do. But the point is, they're consulting him. I remember with some of the stuff with Grogu and stuff, Filoni kept talking about how he actually gave Lucas a call and consulted him about this stuff. And again, this is why it's successful, right? They're reaching out to the guy that created this stuff.
Yeah. It's it's one of those things that when you look at Star Wars and like I said, the impact that has had on people, it's a cultural phenomenon. Yes, it's an icon. It's all those things, wonderful things that we could ever say about it and that's why we do the show and all this, but the way it impacted people's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And taking someone like even just my own personal story, that's what got me into wanting to do production in the first place, was seeing that movie. I've been watching TV for years as a kid, but it wasn't until I saw that movie I was like, man, this is really cool. Like, how do they do this stuff? And it looks so. It's not like any other space movie I've ever seen before. And it just had a different feeling to me, and I
Yes.
got the story instantly. Like
Yes.
I didn't have to guess about it. It was there, and I fell in love with the characters, the story, all of it. Now sounding Han Solo. It's true,
Well,
all
but I
of it.
mean, the thing is, you bring up a good point, though, right? Because the reason why is it's familiar. There's a lot of
Yeah.
classic storytelling techniques and thing that Lucas used. He combined a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
timeless sources and created a new timeless mythology for a new
Yep.
generation, and that continued basically for a while until
Mm-hmm.
Disney started to mess it up a little bit.
Yeah, the House of the Mouse started, getting in the way of some things.
Now, that
But
said, though, I just
mhm,
want to make this clear. I think they're starting to swing it the other way. I think they're starting to fix some of their mistakes.
sure. I mean, I think they started with that with Favreau and Filoni, like I said, allowing them to do Mandalorian. That just shows you, like, when you have people who get it, let them run it. And
Let them run
that's
it,
been my
yeah.
whole thing is just let them run the story brand of Star Wars. Let them be over that. And then if Kathleen Kennedy just wants to, be the banker and just start giving the money to these various projects, okay, cool, fine. But just let these guys create well done content because it's been proven that they can do it. From Filoni's telling his stories along with Lucas and the Clone Wars. He's did Rebels, he's done, and now he's got the Mandalorian. So that's gone on for 2 seasons, done really well. On his way to a third. I'm hoping it's going to rock out. So, I mean, let the guys who actually understand the art create. Just get out of their way.
Well, and I agree. So, I mean, that begs a question. Just the thing that we basically brought up in the first place. When should The Mandalorian end?
Like I said before, when you no longer have that story, and that's what I mean. Like that's the difference between like I would say a Favreau and Filoni versus like a Kathleen Kennedy thing. It's just like, oh well, everyone loves the Mandalorian. Why are we stopping here? We made this money in this quarter, or last year the Mandalorian brought in X amount of viewers and our ratings are through the roof. We should go for another season. What's wrong? Okay, well, maybe you guys need some time off. No, we just don't have anywhere to go right now. Well, can we just do? We don't have anywhere to go right now, but can we just we don't have anywhere to go? Like, just let it die. I must now sound like Luke, but yeah,
Either
it's
that or
you have
Kylo,
to
kill the
right.
past. Well, but here's the thing though, and I agree. There's a couple of things to consider though, just in those points that you brought out. Number one of the nice things about the way that seasons work now, because it used to be season premiere would be like end of September, early October, and then it would go for like 22 episodes, was like an average season back then. And
hmm
so it would end somewhere in May, right? And then you started getting the next evolution of that was you would get these like mid-season replacement shows. So they would order maybe like 12, 14 episodes of a show. 24 was like that, where it would start in January and end in May. It was like these little like half seasons or something. And so now though, you basically have, there was a time where The Mandalorian was premiering in like November, and then it started premiering. It just, there's no real set thing. So what they could do is like, let's say after season 4, right? They just come up and they're like, man, we're a little bit dry right now.
hmm
Okay, so you just don't make a season 5 for a year or two. It's not like you
hmm
actually have to do this concurrently, right? You don't have to be like, all right, well, by next November, we need a new season. Just wait till you have some motivation and then make another season.
That's true, but and that's the hard part though sometimes, because with that, and I agree with you. I definitely agree with you, but the way society is, and that's why I brought it up now, it's like if you wait too long, like, people forget about it and they've moved on to something else, and when you try to come back to it, it's almost like you've lost them.
Well, how about this
So
then?
it's kind of hmm
Well, okay, same scenario. But maybe you don't have another season in you. Maybe you got a good story for a movie. So you end season 4, you make a movie. That buys you a little bit of time, keeps you out there a little bit, and it's a little bit less stressful because you only have to come up with one story. And so you make
hmm
that movie, and that buys you another year or something until you can maybe come up with some. I'm just suggesting things that
yeah.
if you
No, I
did,
get you.
you know what I mean? If you didn't really want to just end the show outright, right? Because that's the problem. It's like if you're a little bit dry for stories, that might not necessarily be a forever thing. I mean, it kind of goes back to what you said at the beginning of our show tonight. If you just think that you've gone everywhere that you can go with either the character or the show itself, then yes, by all means, cap it off, end it at season
hmm
whatever. I mean, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say it would probably be smart maybe to end the show at season 5. Again, that's just
hmm
kind of me just gauging where everything's going.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and this gets back to what I was saying before too, let's say that maybe you still got some gas in the tank, you're just running through a little bit of a dry spell. The doing a movie in between a season or something might be a good way to do it. If you didn't necessarily want to end the show, but you knew that, hey, I just don't have enough good ideas right now to create another season.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, like I said, I think you have to do what's best for the franchise and the character, and I think
Yes.
and ultimately that's what's going to be best for the fans, because if you're going to start giving them crappy stuff, then it's all for naught. It's like you might as well have kept that, because if they hate it, what was the point? What did you gain from it?
Well, that
Nothing.
kind of goes back to what we said, right? Is that if you end prematurely, then everybody's like, "What? You guys could have easily gone 2 more seasons." But if you do just go that extra season, and then suddenly people are like, "Ooh, maybe you should have ended last season." It's like
Yeah.
it's kind of like you said. You gotta, as a creator, you have to basically gauge the story. You have to just internally say to yourself, look, how much story do I really have, and how much story could I really sustain? And that has to, I think, be your driving force. So I basically
Absolutely.
said season 5 is probably when they would start running out of gas in the tank, so to speak. What if you had to guess when?
I would say 5. I'd say 5 seasons would be good. I think that's a nice baseline number, for a series like this. Because, like I said, you just don't want to, like, okay. I mean, unless something this crazy happens in some of the other seasons or whatnot, I really don't see past 5. Because, like I say, there's other stories you can develop. Like, okay, Mandalorian is, like I said, that hub, and we've already gotten Book of Boba Fett. We've gotten Ahsoka. We might get 2 or 3 more other characters out of Mandalorian. Well, now those shows can go off and do their own thing, and you know,
Well, not only
be
that,
successful.
but that would be a good way to continue the Mandalorian story without necessarily having the Mandalorian show.
Right.
Right? So maybe they couldn't sustain the entire show. So what you do is you go, okay, let's just say hypothetically, season 5 is the last season of The Mandalorian. You've spun off like 5 shows on the thing. And okay, that's the end for the Mandalorian series, but you could take Din's character, right? And you could just throw him indefinitely into different story arcs. And that's a way to continue the story of him without necessarily having him have to carry an entire series for, like 10 seasons or something.
Right.
All right. But the important question is, you guys, y'all saw what went on in the chat today and what their thoughts are. And of course, you guys in the chats, you still have about 20 seconds or so to maybe throw in there how many seasons you think it should go and when you think it should end. But the important thing is you guys watching too. If you're watching the rebroadcast of this thing, again, don't forget to hit that like button. Helps the channel grow, helps us put us in front of more faces and get even more discussion going. Leave in the comment section what you guys think about the ending of The Mandalorian. How do you think it should end? And more importantly, when do you think it should end? Let's keep the conversation going. So Friday, and we might have a live show. I don't know. I don't know what the schedule is going to be like yet. I mean, obviously it's going to be reviewing Andor Andor episode 5. But whether that comes to you guys pre-recorded or whether it comes to you guys live is a decision we're going to have to make a little bit late. So just check it out. Friday night at 8. Somehow there's going to be an episode. It's either going to be live or pre-recorded. And if you guys have any ideas of maybe what we should talk about on our Monday show, float those in the comment section too. We always like to get viewer suggestions and ideas and everything else. So with that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the force be with you, always.